Hello everyone, I am Ho Shidoken. Today I will talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. Does Russia really have no chance of making a comeback? There were three territorial expansions in Russian history, which occurred during the periods of Peter the Great, Catherine II, and Stalin. It can be found that in the process of Russia's rise, diplomacy is more important than military. The War of Spanish Succession brought Russia its first opportunity for expansion. In the early 18th century, as the rise of France broke the geographical balance in Western Europe, Britain, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire and others formed an anti-French alliance and a large-scale war broke out with France. This war lasted for more than 10 years, from land to sea, and the entire Western Europe was involved. The Great War in Western Europe gave Russia a rare opportunity for expansion. Peter the Great took advantage of the inability of powerful countries such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands to intervene abroad and decisively launched a war against Sweden. He successfully seized large tracts of land along the Baltic Sea and turned Russia from a landlocked country into a land-sea composite country. Peter the Great moved the Russian capital to St. Petersburg and started the path to westernization. The French Revolution brought Russia a second opportunity for expansion. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out, and France, the strongest country in Europe, fell into civil strife. Countries in Western Europe also closed their doors for fear of the spread of the revolution. Powerful countries such as Britain, Prussia, and Austria actively intervened in France's internal affairs, intending to nip the French Revolution in the bud. The Russian Empress, Catherine II, seized the once-in-a-century opportunity and launched a war against Turkey, successfully occupying large tracts of land along the Black Sea coast. Not only that, she also joined forces with Prussia and Austria to completely divide Poland. At this time, France was in civil strife, and Britain was busy seizing French colonies in North America, so it could only turn a blind eye to Russia's expansion. World War II brought Russia a third expansion opportunity. During World War II, with the help of Britain and the United States, the Soviet Union successfully defeated Germany, occupied large areas of Eastern Europe, and pushed its sphere of influence to the Elbe River. After World War II, out of the need to dismantle the British and French colonial systems, the United States secretly cooperated with the Soviet Union and acquiesced in the Soviet Union's expansion in Asia, establishing an unprecedentedly vast red empire. World War II gave the Soviet Union a coveted strategic environment. Traditional European powers such as Britain, France, and Germany were defeated. The Soviet Union became the sole master of Europe and achieved a goal that previous Rs had failed to achieve. Therefore, historically speaking, the key to Russia's successful expansion has been more diplomatic opportunities than military strength. Every 100 years, the international order will undergo a major change. From the Westphalian system to the Vienna system, from the Versailles system to the Yalta system, Russia has been able to seize the opportunity every time and successfully rise. If we say that the War of Spanish Succession, the French Revolution, and World War II each brought three expansion opportunities for Russia, today's world is in a period of replacement between the old and new international orders, which allows Russia to see the opportunity for its fourth expansion. Why did Russia choose to launch Russo-Ukrainian war in 2022 instead of 2008 or 2014? From a military perspective, the timing seemed better more than 10 years ago, because at that time the Ukrainian military was weak and no match for the Russian army. But from a diplomatic perspective, 2022 is the best time for Russia to launch a war for the following reasons. 1. Compared with 2014, the EU will be more dependent on Russian energy in 2022. In 2014, the EU still had many coal plants and nuclear power plants, and it could be self-sufficient in energy. In 2022, 40% of the EU's energy will come from Russia. Moreover, affected by the COVID-19 epidemic, Western supply chains have been impacted and are experiencing a once-in-30-year inflation. Natural gas inventories are at historically low levels, and people are protesting against energy price increases. Therefore, after the war between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, Germany and France chose appeasement and tried to compromise with Russia. Because if pushed too hard, Russia would cut off natural gas, and a large number of people would freeze to death in Europe, which experienced a cold spring last year. 2. Historically, Britain was Russia's traditional rival, and Russia's many expansionary actions were blocked by Britain. Compared with 2014, the UK's ability to intervene abroad has dropped significantly. After Brexit, the UK no longer has much influence on EU diplomacy. Moreover, the UK is facing the Scottish referendum and a financial crisis. Therefore, at the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the UK's support for Ukraine remained more than words. 3. As a country that spans Europe and Asia and guards the Black Sea, Turkey's attitude is very critical. Before 2016, Turkey was extremely tough on Russia. It not only opened fire on Russian troops in Syria, but also shot down Russian aircraft. However, in 2016, pro-American forces launched a coup in Turkey. Thanks to Putin's advanced tip-off, Erdogan managed to escape the disaster. Since then, Turkey has shifted from being pro-American to being pro-Russian. Since the Russo-Ukrainian war last year, Turkey has refused to impose sanctions on Russia and actively mediates Russia-Ukraine relations. 4. Saudi Arabia was once a die-hard ally of the United States. Especially when the old King Abdullah was alive, Saudi Arabia and the United States almost wore a pair of pants. After the Crimean crisis broke out in 2014, Saudi Arabia cooperated with the United States in increasing oil production and suppressed oil prices from $110/barrel to $25/barrel. Russia's oil revenue dropped significantly and its financial situation worsened. But 2017 became a watershed in Saudi-US relations. That year, Saudi Arabia changed the inheritance system from brother to father to son. The crown prince also became the young Salman, starting the road to centralization of power. Saudi Arabia and the United States have serious ideological differences, especially after Biden came to power. These differences have significantly expanded. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States is estranged, and Saudi Arabia has become closer to China and Russia. After the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, Saudi Arabia rejected Biden's request to increase oil production, causing oil prices to remain high for a time, allowing Russia to make a lot of money through high oil prices. 5. After the Crimean crisis in 2014, Belarus once supported Ukraine because it was also afraid of being annexed by Russia. However, under the instigation of the West, a color revolution almost broke out during the 2020 Belarusian election. Thanks to Russia's military suppression, Belarusian President Lukashenko was able to secure his position. Since then, Belarus has obeyed Russia's words. Before the Russo-Ukrainian war broke out last year, Belarus was willing to give the Russian army an excuse to conduct a surprise attack on Kiev. This was simply impossible in 2014. 6. The most important change is Sino-US relations. In 2008, Sino-US relations were at their best period after the Cold War. In 2014, Sino-US relations were still about one another. However, since 2018, Sino-US relations have gradually deteriorated. China has replaced Russia as the largest competitor of the United States, and most of the US military has been deployed to East Asia. This has greatly eased Russia's strategic pressure. If Russia launched a Russo-Ukrainian war in 2008, the United States would most likely intervene, because at that time the United States would still place its strategic focus on Europe. This situation has changed greatly in 2022. In the early days of the Russia-Ukraine war, the United States only provided verbal support to Ukraine and even suggested that Ukraine establish a government in exile. The worse the relationship between China and the United States, the less the United States will dare to be too tough on Russia, and the greater Russia's diplomatic space will be. Not only that, a powerful China has also successfully restrained Japan, preventing it from taking advantage of the Russian-Ukrainian war to recapture the 4 northern islands. In other words, the countries in the world that can intervene in the Russia-Ukraine war, including China, the United States, Germany, France, Britain, Japan, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Belarus, and other countries, will either appease Russia at the beginning of 2022 or side with Russia. From the perspective of the diplomatic environment, Russia knew the timing of launching the Russo-Ukrainian war very well. It is easy to encounter Western interference in the early years, and it is easy for Ukraine to join NATO in the later years. 2022 is the best time. The biggest change in international politics in the past decade has been the deterioration of Sino-US relations. In 2011, the United States announced its return to the Asia-Pacific and regarded China as a major threat. The outbreak of the Sino-US trade war in 2018 meant that China and the United States were completely at odds, shifting from competition to confrontation. The confidence that Russia dares to launch a war between Russia and Ukraine comes from the diplomatic space created by the confrontation between China and the United States. It is said that Russia is China's shield, but China is not Russia's shield. A strong China will prevent the United States from using all its strength to deal with Russia as it did before. Finally, in this spring of 2022, the Russian army marched towards Kiev. They concluded that the United States did not dare to intervene because it was worried about the threat from China. Europe chose appeasement because of its demand for natural gas. India and Turkey would secretly support Russia. and oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia would by refusing to increase oil production, Russia's energy weapons will be most effective, and the West's economic sanctions can only be used lightly. This strategy is almost seamless, but Putin still misses one layer of calculation. No matter how good the strategy is, it must be executed by the right people. Russia is facing a once-in-a-century opportunity for expansion, but the combat effectiveness of the Russian army is obviously not comparable to that of Peter the Great, Catherine II, and Stalin. The Russian army, known as the number one in the world, actually ran into a wall in Ukraine and suffered extremely heavy losses. This result is unbelievable even to the United Kingdom and the United States. Russia has the right time and place, but lacks the people and people. It has to be said that Russia in 2022 is in the right place at the right time. The confrontation between China and the United States, high global inflation, and the deterioration of relations between Saudi Arabia and the United States are Russia's best times. Belarus's use of the Channel and Turkey's ban on Western warships entering the Black Sea give Russia a geographical advantage. Russia's comprehensive national strength is 10 times that of Ukraine. Ukraine is not only the poorest country in Europe, but its finances are also on the verge of collapse. But what Russia lacks most is peace and harmony. Putin overestimated the combat effectiveness of the Russian army and underestimated the determination of the Ukrainian military and civilians to resist. As a result, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict turned from a blitzkrieg to a war of attrition, and the Russian army fell into a quagmire of war. So will Russia definitely fail miserably? Not necessarily. Before September last year, domestic public opinion liked to exaggerate Russia's advantages, believing that Russia would become richer as it fought more and the West would eventually compromise with Russia because of energy issues. However, after Ukraine's counteroffensive in September last year, domestic public opinion liked to exaggerate Russia's disadvantages, believing that Russia's financial and military capabilities were unsustainable. In fact, Russia is not as strong as public opinion thought it was at the beginning of the war. But it is also not as weak as public opinion has devalued it now. As a big country, Russia has extremely strong resource reserves and war potential. It will not be easy for the West to overthrow Russia. Here we mainly compare the respective disadvantages and shortcomings of Russia and Ukraine. The progress of the Russian army is directly proportional to the density of shelling. Russia's shortcomings are mainly insufficient artillery shell production capacity. Since World War II, the Soviet army has liked to emphasize the artillery doctrine and use artillery to tear apart the opponent's defense line and cause huge damage to the opponent. Last summer, the Russian army successfully suppressed the Ukrainian army by firing more than 50,000 artillery shells per day. During that period, the Ukrainian army suffered heavy casualties and lost a lot of territory. However, as time goes by, 80% of the 15 million artillery shells stockpiled by the Russian army before the war has been consumed. On the other hand, after Russia's partial mobilization, the arsenal worked in 3 shifts to produce artillery shells. However, its annual production of artillery shells could only be increased to 1.6 million, which was only enough to fight on the battlefield for more than a month. Therefore, Russia's ammunition supply pressure is very high. Without artillery shells, even more cannons can only become decorations. In contrast, Western ammunition supplies also face shortages. Before the war between Russia and Ukraine, U.S. artillery shell production was only 1/10 of Russia's. Although the United States spent heavily on laying production lines and planned to increase artillery shell production by 600%, from 15,000 shells/month to 90,000 shells/month. This output's still not enough for battlefield consumption. In order to supply artillery shells to Ukraine, the United States did not hesitate to search for ammunition from South Korea, Israel, Pakistan, and other countries, and also converted some Air Force bombs into land-based artillery shells. But even so, Ukraine still faces the problem of ammunition shortage. The EU is even worse. Since the start of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the EU has emptied most of its ammunition stocks in order to assist Ukraine. Many countries, including Germany, have run out of artillery shells. Artillery became the decisive weapon in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In other words, by the spring and summer of this year, the Russian and Ukrainian armies will face a shortage of artillery shells. However, this will have a greater impact on the Russian army, because the Russian army relies much more on artillery shells than the Ukrainian army. When there are no artillery shells, the two sides can only fight at close range. The Russian army, which has lost its firepower advantage, will find it difficult to take advantage when facing the Ukrainian army. This has been fully proven in the Battle of Kiev last year. Although the artillery shell manufacturing process is not complicated, it still requires the cooperation of dozens of industrial departments. Through the Russo-Ukrainian War, we can find that both Russia and the West are facing serious deindustrialization problems. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's supply chain was broken and many weapons and ammunition factories closed down. The West is not much better. At present, the European and American economies are dominated by the service industry, with a low proportion of manufacturing. Facing a large-scale war of attrition, it is difficult for Europe and the United States to temporarily build large-scale ammunition production lines because they cannot find so many skilled workers. Even the production of artillery shells with low technical content requires the cooperation of dozens of industrial departments, which is a big test for countries with incomplete industrial categories. Population density of Russian occupied and Ukrainian occupied areas. If Russia's shortcoming is artillery shell production capacity, Ukraine's shortcoming is its human resource reserves. Before the war, Ukraine had a population of 43 million, making it the most populous country in Europe. However, after the war, the densely populated Adong region was occupied by Russia. There are approximately 9 million people in this area. Not only that, after the war, 8 million people from Ukraine fled to the west. Ukraine's actual controlled population is far lower than the book data, only more than 20 million people, which is not as good as Shanghai. What's even more troublesome is that Ukraine has a serious aging problem, with a low proportion of young and middle-aged men, which brings huge difficulties to military recruitment. Comparison of Ukraine's demographic structure in 2021 and 2023. Specifically, Ukraine has only 3.6 million men of working age aged 20 to 39, one-sixth that of Russia. In terms of human resource reserves, Ukraine has a great disadvantage compared to Russia. Even if the exchange ratio is 1:1, Ukraine's human resources will be exhausted first if it continues. This is why Ukraine recruits veterans, but veterans who are too old and have limited physical strength can only play a supporting role on high-intensity battlefields. Therefore, it is also a war of attrition. Afghanistan and Iraq can fight for 10 years, but Ukraine cannot. Middle Eastern countries generally have high fertility rates, so young people can be used as cannon fodder. However, the fertility rate in Ukraine is too low, and many people who have emigrated may not be willing to return to the country. Young people are the most precious resource, and it is difficult to replenish it once it is lost. Since the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War, Ukraine's young population aged 15 to 34 has dropped by more than 50%, causing a serious collapse in its demographic structure. The aging of the population has made modern wars less able to withstand casualties than during World War II. During World War II, countries had high fertility rates and were less worried about the problem of young people being exposed. Once a modern aging country loses a large number of young people, the entire country will have no successors. Therefore, for Russia, although it faces a shortage of ammunition supply, if it can kill a large number of Ukrainian troops, Russia has no chance of winning. According to the maximum mobilization rate of 3:1 among the belligerents in World War I and World War II, Ukraine can only mobilize a maximum of 1.2 million people out of 3.6 million young adults to go to the battlefield and undertake frontline combat tasks. This is already the limit of its manpower. Otherwise, if you arrest strong men at will, it will only lead to low morale and the risk of mutiny in the troops. In other words, with Western assistance, Ukraine has a comparative advantage in the supply of weapons and ammunition, while Russia has a comparative advantage in human resource reserves. According to EU President von der Leyen, more than 100,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed since the war began. This figure is similar to estimates on the battlefield, and most of them were caused before September last year. The number of injured in modern warfare is usually 3 times the number of killed, so Ukraine may have suffered 400,000 casualties, accounting for 1/3 of its total mobilization strength. This means that if Russia can cause the same scale of damage to Ukraine as last year in the future, consuming hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops every year, Ukraine will face the risk of exhausting its human resources by the end of 2024. Similar to Germany at the end of World War II, its military resources were completely exhausted and it was unable to sustain the war. No matter how many weapons there were not enough personnel to operate them. The craters and bones left on the Bakhmut battlefield. In comparison, Russian casualties were not low. The Russian army is divided into 4 parts: the Russian Defense Forces, the Wagner mercenaries, the Donbass militia, and the Chechen armed forces. Among them, the Russian Defense Forces are the most well-equipped, but due to their main offensive mission, they have suffered more than 60,000 casualties since the war began. The Wagner mercenaries absorbed many criminals and fought the most ruthlessly, but also suffered heavy casualties. They consumed about 40,000 people, some of whom may have escaped. The combat effectiveness of the Donbass militia is average, with approximately 20,000 to 30,000 casualties since the war began. The Chechen armed forces were more of a showman, and the casualties were negligible. Overall, the casualties of the Russian army exceeded 100,000, which is not a small number. Judging from the book, the damage to the Ukrainian army is greater than that of the Russian army, and Russia's young and middle-aged human resource reserves are 6 times that of Ukraine. Therefore, Russia's best strategy is to compete with Ukraine for manpower consumption. Even if the exchange ratio is 1:1, Russia will not suffer. It will also cause millions of casualties, which will be a devastating blow to Ukraine's demographic structure. Although it is difficult for Russia to accept it politically, it can barely do so in terms of manpower. This is also the reason why the Russian army wants to fight with Ukraine in Bakhmut. Bakhmut has no strategic value, but fighting a war of attrition in Bakhmut can force Ukraine to shed its last drop of blood, similar to verbal in World War I. Like climbing a fortress, turning this place into a meat grinder for Russia and Ukraine. For Ukraine, the best strategy is not to fight head-on with Russia, but to retain combatants as much as possible, trade space for time, and wait for the arrival of Western heavy weapons before planning a counterattack. As the saying goes, if people survive and the land is lost, everyone and the land will survive. If people lose the land, everyone will survive. I wonder if Zelensky can realize this. For Russia, its best strategy is to take the initiative, engage in a large-scale decisive battle with Ukraine, and inflict large-scale destruction on the Ukrainian army like last year. However, it is not easy for the Russian army to achieve the same results as last year, because the current Russian-Ukrainian army is more of a positional war than a mobile war. The Ukrainian army is much more tactful than before. In the face of Russian artillery attacks, the Ukrainian army hides in fortifications as much as possible. Without coming out, it will not be easy for the Russian army to encircle and annihilate the main force of the Ukrainian army. Moreover, the Russian army is facing a shortage of ammunition, and its firepower advantage may be gradually equalized by Ukraine. Ukraine used flesh and blood to make up for its lack of firepower. Therefore, it is very difficult for both the Russian and Ukrainian armies at the moment. The Russian artillery shells are being fired one less time, and the Ukrainian soldiers are being killed one less time. Both sides are operating to the limit, and Ukraine is delaying as much as possible, waiting for the arrival of Western heavy weapons. The Russian army is planning to launch a new round of offensive in an attempt to kill and injure the Ukrainian army in large numbers. The trend of the war depends on whether Russia runs out of ammunition first or the Ukrainian army runs out first. This kind of war is very tragic, similar to World War I and World War II, where ammunition is exchanged for people. From a financial perspective, Russia and Ukraine are not short of money for the time being. Ukraine receives 5 billion euros in financial assistance from the West every month, and the Ukrainian army can also go to the EU to receive training and supplies. Although Russia's energy revenue has dropped significantly since the war began and its fiscal deficit has risen sharply, the Russian government's debt ratio is very low and there is a lot of room for borrowing. It is expected that Russia's national debt will increase by 3 trillion rubles this year. In addition, the Russian government is also considering selling foreign exchange assets such as gold and renminbi worth tens of billions of dollars to fill its fiscal deficit. In the case of a protracted war, Russia's financial resources can support it for at least 2 more years. If Russia wants to win the war, if it is not short of money, it must consider general mobilization and transition to a wartime economic system similar to the Soviet Union during World War II. After conscripting 500,000 troops, Russia no longer lacks soldiers. What it mainly lacks now is artillery shells. Therefore, Russia needs to build more artillery shell production lines and increase its artillery shell production capacity to more than 5 million rounds per year to completely overwhelm Ukraine in terms of firepower. In order to achieve this goal, Russia has to drive millions of people into factories to produce weapons and ammunition as it did during Stalin's time. General mobilization means failure or failure. If it wins, the Russian Empire can be rebuilt, and Putin becomes the successor of Peter the Great. If it fails, internal conflicts will rise sharply, and Russia will face the risk of revolution and unrest. Generally speaking, in addition to Russia and Ukraine, what determines the trend of the Russia-Ukraine war is the United States and the European Union. If either party cannot sustain/stop support, the war may end early. For Russia, its biggest constraint is its artillery shell production capacity. It produces 1.6 million artillery shells a year, which is only enough to last 2 months on the battlefield. This means that it must either carry out general mobilization and go all out to produce weapons and ammunition, either buy artillery shells from the big Eastern countries. But the current policy focus of the big Eastern countries is on the economy, and they are not willing to easily intervene in the Russia-Ukraine war. For Ukraine, its biggest constraint is human resources. Ukraine has mobilized more than 1 million young people to fight on the battlefield, reaching the limit of what it can mobilize. Once these young people are killed or injured in action, it will be an irreparable loss to Ukraine. Therefore, Ukraine must use its troops carefully to avoid fighting a war of attrition with Russia and gradually build up its advantages with Western weapons assistance. Otherwise, even if it achieves a Pyrrhic victory, meaning 1,000 casualties to the enemy and 800 losses to itself, Ukraine may collapse. EU natural gas inventory changes. For the EU, the main factor that determines its aid to Ukraine is changes in natural gas inventories. Last year, Russia pinned its hopes on a cold winter that would accelerate the EU's natural gas consumption and force it to negotiate peace with Russia. However, Europe is facing a once-in-a-decade warm winter, with demand for natural gas falling sharply and natural gas inventories at historically high levels. After overcoming the natural gas crisis, the EU became extremely tough on Russia. It not only demanded that Russia withdraw its troops unconditionally, but also increased its arms assistance to Ukraine. In the future, the EU plans to purchase liquefied natural gas from the United States at high prices to completely replace Russian natural gas. Whether this goal can be achieved is uncertain. For the United States, the midterm elections will not change the process of aid to Ukraine. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have a strong consensus on policies toward China and Russia. If Russia wants the United States to change its stance toward Russia, it can only hope that Trump wins the presidential election in 2024. If Trump becomes president, he will quickly cut off aid to Ukraine and withdraw from NATO affairs. However, the U.S. election is still 2 years away, and Trump's electoral situation is becoming increasingly unfavorable. His latest approval rating has dropped to 30%. Therefore, it is unrealistic to expect the U.S. to cut aid to Ukraine in the short term. In short, Russian ammunition stocks, Ukrainian human resource reserves, EU natural gas stocks, and U.S. election prospects are the 4 most important factors that determine the trend of the Russia-Ukraine war. The war will continue until either side can no longer hold on.